Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellished Podcast, a podcast focused on product stories, product storytellers, interesting brand ambassadors, and any other tangent that I happen to come up with. Whether you're a bourbon fan, geek, casual observer, or someone who is just floating through this channel, you're sure to waste a few minutes, and I hope you enjoy what I have to say. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to go hit the subscribe button. I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. If you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll try to get that taken care of. I also generally live stream these episodes around 9:30 on Wednesday nights. As you can tell, we're doing it at 8:30 tonight because I have a special guest. You can find all of my links on Instagram at EmbellishPod or Twitter with the same handle, TikTok as well. Not sure what that platform's for, but we're going to see what happens. I have a website at www.embellishpod.com. That is also a place to pick up any links, episode details, and even some one-off terrible tasting notes. Today is February the 2nd, 2022, and we're going to have Alan Bishop from French Lick Spirits, The Alchemist Cabinet, Distillers Talk, the Alan Bishop Day, and so much more joining us tonight. Thank you for joining me, Alan. I really enjoy your presence on social media. And this is not one of those like pat you on the back things. I mean, it is pat you on the back. Your presence, at least from the things that I watch and participate in, like Distillers Talk or whatever, it's sort of refreshing, like stepping outside of a nice warm house on a really, really cold, brisk day. It just kind of hits you and slaps you in the face, but it's also got like a degree of purity to it. So
remind you that you're alive a little bit. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Remind you that you're alive and that sometimes the world is full of shit, but the fresh air is not. So,
yeah, absolutely. No, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on, man. And that's the goal, is to make people realize that good spirits can be made outside of Kentucky, and B, that the distilling industry is ridiculous because it's literally the only other industry that these sort of things can happen in is the pro wrestling industry. So don't take it too seriously.
Yeah, that's very, very, very spot on. I do appreciate you for joining me because I do have a small podcast here. Don't have a huge following. And I'll caveat this, and I said it before we started. If any of the questions I toss out you have any objection to, just tell me to fuck off. Doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do. Before we get too far into whiskey, I do want to. So you started in farming / gardening / trying to sell unique crops. Did I remember this correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess really started even before that as a kid. I mean, just growing up in a family of they worked at my dad and my grandpa both worked at a furniture factory, and we had a tobacco farm. So I grew up on a tobacco farm and making moonshine. That's really kind of where my roots are at. So, and then later that got turned into organic farming, and then subsequently tied to distillation, because it turns out that everybody in the Ohio Valley has a fucking garden and you can't make any money at the farmer's market. So unless you sell moonshine at the farmer's market.
You're exactly right. This is the thing that I always find humorous, and we're similarly aged, but whenever I was a kid, my entire family, we grew gardens. You're right. Organic farming was a thing we did. Not because we made a choice not to use chemicals, just because we couldn't afford the chemicals, right? Yeah. You just did whatever you did and spent a lot of time hoeing weeds from around tomato plants. But what used to be a sign of being like, oh, you don't have any money is because you can and put up all of your food, is now like a sign of being hip and trendy and chic. And what the hell? Like, how did this happen?
There's an old school saying here around Pekin, Indiana, Pekin, as we call it. Just because you're poor, don't mean you have to be dirty. And now that's popular,
right? Absolutely.
So
yeah, it's, and when I'm having to fight hipsters for cannon lids and rings, I'm not okay with that.
No, yeah, absolutely not. Well, and the true mark of whether or not they're sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And everybody has this weird kind of fucked up view of what sustainable means as far as farming goes anyways, because even the old estates, back in the day, they weren't sustainable of their own accord. They had to trade outside, et cetera, et cetera. And so everybody has this idea, this grand utopian idea of I can survive and I can do all these things myself. Listen, as someone with experience here, let me tell you that everything that sounds like a great idea to you, where you're like, I'm going to grow a garden, I'm going to save seeds, and I'm going to have chickens, I'm going to have ducks, and there's going to be some pigs over here. Everything you add to the system wants to fuck up another part of the system the first chance it fucking gets. And it will. And, I even remember probably what got me interested in this. I was into the heirloom seed thing before it was ever popular. But we always had, a couple tomato varieties we saved seed from, but even the tobacco thing, we grew burley tobacco. That's what we made our money off of. But, by the time my dad took the farm over in the mid 90s, hybrid burley tobacco was already a thing. It had been for a long time, since at least since the Green Revolution. We were still saving tobacco seed and planting an old open pollinated burley tobacco.
Yep.
And not only because seed was relatively expensive for what it was, but also because that tobacco was adapted to our farm, and because we had to use less fertilizer and we had to use less chemicals. And even though our tobacco was smaller than some of the stuff that went to market, we could make more money off of it because it was a better quality,
Right.
Because it was up against that adversity. And tobacco is one of those crops, strangely enough, that as long as you can keep the bugs off of it and you don't get a hailstorm that damages it, the more adversity that you throw up against it, the better quality it actually is.
Yeah, so I'm in the heart of West Kentucky dark fire country, and that's we're very familiar with that. I spent a lot of time, eyeball even with suckering tobacco
I
plants.
never was jealous of you dark fired guys and those little short madole plants. And I mean, at least the shit we were dealing was 5-6 feet tall, so it's at eye level when you're topping it, as opposed to that stuff that 2-3 feet tall. And
it's not fun when it's 3. It's not bad when it's 3 feet tall when you're 3 feet tall, right? Like but when you get older, it does get problematic. They're getting taller, but it was always interesting whenever I was in college. I would have friends that would come down here from Chicago or New York or somewhere else. And inevitably, I would always have to start at the beginning of the fall semester and be like, look, don't call the fire department when you see a barn that has smoke coming out of it, because we fire our tobacco here. I know it's like a super regional thing, but it's what happens. Like, it's part of it. And take it, there's nothing that smells better in the world to me than that. But
amazing.
We're very familiar with the tobacco situation.
Or even just going to memories are usually distinctly tied to either aromas or sounds or tastes. And one memory multiple memories of the same thing, but one place I can take myself back to, no matter how, and I think even if I live to be 110, this is like the one thing I'll always know, is the smell of the tobacco warehouse when we went to go take our tobacco to market December and January. Just that aroma, and like all other traditional arts in the United States, that's about fucking died out. And the warehouse that we used to sell to was it was on what was at that time the outskirts of New Albany, Indiana, and now there's a fucking Walmart there. I've literally walked in and bought a pack of cigarettes from the same place where I used to go sell tobacco. So
it's funny you say that. I work in software now, right? So because I worked in my grandfather grew up doing construction. I grew up in a rural area doing working in tobacco, helping out with construction stuff, and I realized I want to go to college so I don't have to do that, because I've never met a bricklayer that didn't have a bad back by 45.
Absolutely.
But the company I work for now, we used to be situated in 2 old tobacco barns that were converted into office fixtures, and so we worked there. And it was actually a tobacco barn my grandfather had built, and it is a terrible office because it's not insulated. It's not made for humans to exist. And you had to take out the tiers because the tiers were too short for a floor, But we recently renovated and moved to a new building, which was the in-town tobacco warehouse was restored. And so at least to some degree, the building itself was restored, and it's like a historical building and you can't change the windows or whatever. And it's a beautiful facility, but it's now a software engineering building. That's not a thing here anymore.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people don't know this. I don't know how much they even talk about it on tours, but Peerless used to be a tobacco warehouse. And I don't know how long that operated when it went out of business, but I know my family sold tobacco into that warehouse a couple of times way back when. So it's funny how that works. And you mentioned something else. Only people who are familiar with tobaccos really understand that. But, boy, weren't those tiers fun back in the day when you had to fucking hang tobacco, and it was always the young kid that got put up in the very top of the barn, on the wobbly ass piece of wood. When God forbid, you say something to your dad about that piece of wood being wobbly, because what's he going to say? Oh, it's been there for 100 years. We'll be there for another 100.
Exactly. Yeah. And the thing is, I would rather be on the top, because here's the thing: is if you don't stagger right, you end up getting the sweat that drips from the guy above you onto you, and then it drips. If you're the guy on the bottom, you're just dodging everyone else's just absolute filth, filth.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll tell you another one that you'll like about tobacco. And maybe people appreciate these conversations. I don't know, but I think they do, because there's connection, at least between cigars and whiskey anyways. Um, so my grandma, when my dad took over the farm, she grew up. All my family's from Kentucky. They're all from the Bishop side's all from like Greensburg, Hodgenville area.
Mhm.
The Wilsons are all from down around Oneida, Manchester, and that area. So all sides of family grew tobacco. But my grandma, of course, she lived through the Depression, World War II, and every year, every time it rained, she would go up to the tobacco field. And my grandma was like 4 foot nothing. She would literally get down on her hands and knees, and she would crawl through the field, and she'd pull all the bottom leaves. They got mud on them. She'd bring them home. She would wash them under just, water. And then she would hang up a clothesline either on the porch or in the basement, and then start curing that tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad told her one time, he goes, I don't know why you do that. Right. And she goes, well, I'll tell you why. So she had always just thrown it into bulk, right? Not thinking anything of it, not wanting to mess with it. And she goes, I'll show you why I do this. So they made a bet one year, maybe $100, whatever, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But that her little tobacco crop that she cured herself, she kept it for 2 years. She actually took it through the whole cycle. She took it through the curing, and she took it through fermentation, and then she made it in old hands the way they used to do it, tied off, with an actual tobacco leaf. She sold 20 pounds of tobacco for almost 3 times what my dad sold the entire crop for.
A little bit of patience and a little bit of care creates something that is unique and incredibly profitable. And that's, yeah. So we could never talk about whiskey, and we could talk about that, and that would be fine with me, because that's, I like talking about stuff like this. This is, there's a direct line that can be drawn between the history of whiskey and the history of the United States and the history of agriculture. They're all intrinsically tied together. What you're talking about is storing tobacco for long-term utilization, and whiskey is storing grain for long-term utilization. That's what it really is about. So.
Well, and ironically, distilling being agricultural is what it is, obviously, and tobacco being tied to agriculture and to whiskey production. A lot of tobacco growers were whiskey producers, whether legal or illicit. But I started my distilling career in our old tobacco barn. That's where I had my first still at. That's where I had, all the way up into my 20s, I had a 150-gallon pot still that we basically operated out of that old barn. So,
and that's illicit distilling is one of those things that, it's a fun thing for people to portray in, in pop culture, right? Like you make a movie out of it or whatever. And it's, like the heist, the thing that was done on Netflix, or talking about, Ridge Runners or any of those things like that's super fun. But for folks that grew up in rural parts of the South, or, the South, we'll say that for now. It's not uncommon to know like 6 or 7 people that they've got a still. Maybe they make some for their own use. Maybe they make it for other people, whatever, but it's not nearly as rare as pop culture would have you believe. And it's not nearly, it can be in some sense, but in most situations, it's not nearly as sensational as it's made out to be.
Not nearly. And that's that was like culture shock for me going into the legal industry, was how much more actually crooked the legal industry was than what the illicit industry was.
Right.
Like literally, I remember like when I first got hired on at Copper and Kings, I had 2 or 3 weeks where I was like, what the fuck? This is how this works, just seeing how it all worked out. But no, so I'm always, as a, not right at this second, representing the company that I work for. This is Alan Bishop speaking. I am always an advocate for home distilling being legalized. Moonshining got perilously close to dying out. A lot of categories did die out, obviously, with prohibition and also industrialization in the 1870s, distilled spirits to begin with. But the last rough estimate I saw, there's anywhere between 200 to 250,000 current home distillers in the United States, which is pretty impressive. And thankfully, people are getting more interested in sustainability. And I think even this whole fucking COVID ordeal, wherever people land on that shit, it is, if nothing else, it's woken people up. It's woken some people up to what could be and why they should maybe learn how to do these things.
Yep.
And, the only issue that I ever have with it is these guys that I don't know. There's a lot of bullshit, obviously, on moonshiners, and I blame Magilla Entertainment for that as much as anything. But everybody thinks it's some romantic outlaw thing until the first time they ever have to do it to actually pay a bill.
Right.
And it's not like when I was a kid, just like you. I didn't want to farm. I didn't want to make moonshine. It was just shit that we did. That was another reason why, hey, I can't go do anything fun with my friends or
Right.
go on a vacation with my family this weekend, because we're going to be fucking.
Yeah, how many farmers understand the concept of going on vacation? Modern farmers to a degree do, but
Yep.
like, I can't go on vacation because I have cows or because I have to worry about getting ready for the next growing season, whatever it is. It's an
Absolutely.
it's an obscene. It's not an obscene. It's an outside the box concept for most farmers.
I was thinking about it earlier today, actually, because we got this storm coming in, this winter storm, and for maybe about 5 or 6 years before I started distilling legally, while I was still really running the farm, and so we had like 100 to 150 turkeys that we'd raise that were free range, and turkeys won't go back into a house. Like, you'd have to go out every night and literally like catch them or wrangle them into the fucking house. And then we had like 20 something rabbits, and that's what I was thinking about earlier. It's like, thank fucking God I don't have rabbits anymore. I'd have to go out and fucking switch out their water bottles 3 times a fucking day and make sure they're not frozen, and none of them are having fucking babies in sub-zero weather and dying and all that fucking.
Yeah, no, I was outside wrangling chickens to toss in the coop. We have them sheerly out of vanity.
Right.
I have a couple of daughters, and having livestock around is a great life lesson. You can, the circle of life from end to end, from, inception to the end. It's a great lesson. It's nothing more than that. We romanticize the idea of, oh, well, we'll sell eggs for money, but God, you've got to do that on such a huge scale to make any money. I'm not interested in that now. And then when you get chickens and you end up with chicken math, where it's like, I had 6 chickens and then somebody else got 6 chickens and didn't want them anymore. And we're fine with ours. They're like, hey, you want some more chickens? Sure, I guess. And then you end up with 40 chickens. That's just where it happens.
Yeah. And 32 of them are fucking roosters. And then you got to butcher roosters, right?
Exactly.
And then you got like 6 hens over here, farm management stuff, right? And you're like, all right, those are my 6 I'm going to keep to breed with or whatever. And then now all of a sudden, and I'm all about, ecology and wildlife preservation and all that stuff. But now all of a sudden, not only do we have a hawk and an eagle here and there, now they're fucking everywhere, and they go tell all their buddies about the chickens you have in your yard, and then trying to make a living off of it and trying to make money off of it. And then you start realizing that distilling's tied to agriculture, A, so that you can actually make money, and B, so that you can fucking drink yourself through the bullshit.
So you find a way to cope with it, that it's not eating, it's, drinking or smoking some of your tobacco, whatever it happens to be. Yeah, it's all super great.
Yeah. You do the best you can, struggle through it. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So staying in this, I have a question for you, and this may be outside the box. And I apologize if this is not the questions that you were expecting, but I think they're interesting. So we have folks around here that grow sorghum cane for sorghum syrup, right? And I've had this thing that I've been like rolling over my brain for a while, and it got hammered home a little more. I was at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival this year and got to watch Pat High speak, which is always super entertaining. Love that guy. And his episode on Distillers Talk with you. The only thing that I like more than maybe a Pat Heist episode is Todd Leopold. Like those are the anytime Todd's on, I'm like, fantastic. I'm gonna spend an hour and a half. I'm gonna enjoy all this. But anyways, he was talking about he had distilled some of I assume the cane juice to make a rum type beverage.
Yep.
Why is no one making beer, rum, and bourbon from sorghum? Because the grain heads could be beer or could be a whiskey type beverage, not necessarily bourbon, but a whiskey type beverage. Like, is it just like, has somebody tried this and it's crap, or?
Yeah, so I've done a little grain sorghum at home in the past, and it honestly it's very much kind of like sort of buckwheat kind of nuttiness, and you could, because now it falls underneath. This is what's interesting. So Pat was able to get away with calling that a rum because it got approved as a rum, even though it's not technically a rum.
Right.
But underneath the TTB's new rules they introduced just a couple years ago, grain sorghum would be recognized as a pseudo grain, just the same as buckwheat or quinoa or amaranth. So you could use it in a bourbon mash bill as long as obviously it was at least 51% corn. Interestingly enough, TTB, however, does not make a differentiation in sorghum grain versus sorghum juice in those regulations. So you could even technically, now I'm not saying this is right, but if a guy wanted to really piss off some of the bourbon bros and get some attention, you could technically use some of that sorghum juice in a bourbon, and the TTB would still recognize that as being a grain product.
That gets back to the sort of the griminess of legal distilling, you know,
right?
And you mentioned that, you know, like it felt slightly more honest when it was illicit home distilling or whatever. But my interpretation is that at that point, your word is your bond. Can people trust you? So you have to be pretty legitimate to do it. Whereas once there's a rule structure in place, now we as humans can find places where the rules are weak and exploit them, and that's just what we do, you know, regardless of the structure.
Well, and on the illegal side, so people always worried about, you know, alcohol having methanol in it and being poisonous and people not knowing what they were doing. And there was a lot of that, especially during Prohibition. But what I try to tell people a lot of times is most people who were that I knew that were selling product that they were making at home, they grew up around it. They knew what they were doing, and they wanted to make good product, and they didn't want to make anybody sick. Because A, if you make somebody sick or you make a shitty product, they're not going to come back and buy more of it. And
then
B,
people can't be repeat customers.
Yeah. And then on top of it, if you make somebody sick, they're going to end up fucking telling the authorities, and then the heat's going to fucking be on you.
Well, even if they don't tell the authorities, if they have to go to the hospital and they're they're unconscious or whatever, and somebody says, "Hey, what happened?" Well, they were drinking some. You're opening up a can of worms that you're not.
Absolutely.
Nobody's interested in participating in that situation.
Yeah. And I will tell you, having grown up around it and knowing, you know, when I was a kid, they were here, even in Southern Indiana. People don't think of Southern Indiana as being moonshine country, just like they don't think of it being distilling country, but it is, and it always has been. I probably knew 9-10 guys that were really into this. And it's been nice to be able to see this has become a little more open, even though, you know, home distilling is illegal. It's been nice to be able to see people tell their legitimate stories about that background. And there's another parallel there that I'm trying to follow up on now. It's still a little sketchy here in Southern Indiana, but you know, those guys all had interesting, crazy stories. And the other stories that I want to get that people are still a little weird about talking about because it's not legal here yet, in any way, shape, or form. But you know, the marijuana growers that were around here, the Ohio Valley, Southern Indiana, in high times in the 1970s was voted the #1 place in the United States to grow marijuana. Dude, there were tons of growers here. I mean, I went to high school with a boy who was tied to a family that was very prominent in the trade. And there's crazy stories, and I'm trying to get all those stories now before all those old guys pass away.
Right, because most people aren't recording that information.
Nope.
It's funny you mentioned that. You know, we have our own share of that here in Western Kentucky. But a few years back, you know, they legalized industrial hemp growth in the state of Kentucky. And that was like a big thing. Everybody's like, yeah. And so a whole bunch of farmers just jump out and they're like, I'm going to grow hemp because there's high profitability. And there was for the first 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
But they got halfway into the growing season and realized they didn't know what the hell to do with hemp.
Yep. And there were no processing factories. There's nowhere to go with it.
Gives a lot of them. One of the guys I know, he was real smart, and he actually had one of the purchasers was the one that had fronted him all the money. He was basically working as a contract farmer, and so he made all of his money. A lot of people that were hoping to sell it somewhere didn't. But when they started trying to figure out, like, how do we grow this and how do we effectively do this, a lot of them started calling up their old high school buddies who used to grow marijuana illicitly.
How do I deal with this? Tell me.
And be like, what do I do? And those kids made a career of it. It was like, you know, you peruse the recently out of jail list who got out for, you know, cultivation, and you hire that guy, and he comes out and he turns around your grow operation for hemp like that because he knows what to do with it.
Well, I sincerely hope that we see a lot more of that on the distilling side of things too, because I mean, that's how I learned. And when I got hired at Copper and Kings, nobody at Copper and Kings had any distilling experience. They literally relied on a fucking dumbass hillbilly moonshiner from Southern Indiana to set up the protocols. So this is one of the things about the industry that bothers me, and how fucking really pretentious the industry can be, especially with institutions that teach classes and things of that nature. Or, and I'm not going to say his name, although it could. I've talked about him multiple times. People who write books about distilling, and they come out and they do interviews or they teach a class and they say, well, no distillery is going to hire a home distiller, as though you're somehow like the low-life scum of the fucking earth because you did this illegally. You know what? If a distillery won't hire a home distiller, fuck them.
Right.
Because a home distiller has shown, if they're any good at what they do, right? It's pretty easy to find out if they're good at it.
Right.
They have shown that they're passionate about it. They've shown that they're willing to learn it. And there's no matter what scale you're doing it on, home distilling is not an easy art form. It's easier now than it was because you can get decent equipment, you can get decent grain, etc. But you got to really put some time and effort and some money into it to learn what the fuck you're doing, right? And the funny thing is, the gentleman who has said this now multiple times worked for a distillery that started off with 2 fucking home distillers and wrote books about home distilling. And here this motherfucker is saying any respectable distillery is not going to hire a home distiller. Dude, fuck you.
What historical brand didn't start from a home distiller? Like
Absolutely.
What brand that exists did not, like new brands that pop up, right now, like they're maybe not starting from a home distiller, but.
Well, there's an identity crisis in bourbon too. I will say this, and this probably won't make me any more popular than I already am, I'm sure, but I don't really care. It's a funny industry when there are, and I won't get into the political side of things and whatever I believe, but when there are a number of what I will say very soft people who don't want to talk about any of that illegal stuff. They don't want to talk about the rebellious nature of distillation in general, right? Anything that is ugly from history, they don't want to talk about. And this is a new thing that has now happened in the United States, where we have a problem, and the bourbon industry suffers from it too. And yes, a lot of bad things happen, but we have this tendency to read history from the moment we're living in now backwards and go.
You're not putting it in the context of the time whenever that thing occurred, and that's a different lens entirely.
And what they should really do is go back and read from 1500 forward, and then look at the world and go, "Holy shit, things got way the fuck better."
Right. So I will say this: it's the exact same thing as anybody who sits inside of any Christian church. They're trying to apply a book that was written thousands of years ago to modern society, and it doesn't work that way because the context of it was then, not now.
Right.
And so putting the context behind it makes a huge difference, huge difference. But I would even challenge that even if you don't put context behind it, illicit distilling is not significantly different than home brewing. Home brewing, while legal, most of the folks, I would guess, I don't have any information to back this up, but those folks that went from home brewing to starting a microbrewery to starting, doing something along that lines, likely somewhere in there, they sold some of what they made before they were legally allowed to.
Absolutely.
The only way you're not going to know that you're good at what you do just by asking your friends and family. I do this particular podcast because I enjoy doing it. No one in my family, aside from my wife and children, know I do this because I don't want the artificial, "You're doing so good," because they're supportive. That's family, friends, they're supportive. That's great. But you have no idea
what the truth is, what they
got. And so you're going to have to find somebody who's not attached to you through friendship or whatever. And that's likely going to be, you're going to sell it to them. You're going to give it away. You're going to do something illegal to find out.
That's why I go out of my way to have friends that are smart asses like Jolie, because I know they're going to fucking tell me exactly what they think, whether I want to hear it or not. The way that they say it is a different story. But it was always pounded into my head, not just with moonshining, but my dad, he smoked a little weed, and he liked to party, and I'm sure he did plenty of other things. I know he did. He had a lot of friends that were like that, and nobody ever got dumb and got killed or ended up in prison or anything like that. But it was always found in my head that, illegal and immoral are 2 separate issues entirely.
Correct.
Right. And as long as you're minding your own business and you're not fucking with anybody else and you're not causing anybody any problems, and it's none of their fucking business one way or the other. And I think that too often kids get protected from that stuff a lot of times. And now, don't get me wrong, go the opposite direction a lot too. And they see a lot of things that they probably shouldn't on TV, etc. But better that they see some of that stuff when they're younger. Like, I was always around it. I either had the best or worst parents in the world because they didn't hide anything from me. And they'd let me, you'll like this, as growing up on a farm too. They would let me drink and stuff when I was a teenager, and they'd let my friends come over. And if their parents were okay, they always made sure they knew their parents and talked to them. Right. If they were fine with it, they'd come over. But there was always an ulterior motive. And the ulterior motive was, come on over, have fun, get drunk. because you're gonna be up tomorrow
Wake up
morning.
the next morning. The next
Yeah.
morning's gonna be miserable.
Cutting fucking tobacco and the fucking heat. You know, one time, Dad, we had a bunch of firewood we had to cut, and I had 3 or 4 friends over, and he literally at like 5:30 in the morning was outside my bedroom window. He beat on the window a couple times, and then he fired up a fucking chainsaw. And he's like, "Get your ass up and get out here."
Yep, I saw the wrong end of a post hole digger a number of times in scenarios like that. Or here's a shovel and there's a dump truck full of orange gravel. I need you to move it from here to there, one wheelbarrow at a time.
Yeah, I got ironically another tobacco barn story. He decided that when we stopped growing tobacco, that it was always dirt floor barn, that he wanted to gravel the barn. And so it was summertime. I think I was in 7th grade. So we ordered a triaxle load of fucking gravel. And then he bought, instead of buying a wheelbarrow, and he did it to fuck with me, right? He buys a fucking 30-gallon Coleman cooler and a shovel. Right. And it was like, by the end of this week, I want this barn graveled. Just me out there just shoveling this Coleman cooler full of fucking gravel, dragging it across the yard, trying to it was a fucking nightmare. But you know what? Stuff like that is worthwhile. It teaches you a lot of hard lessons. And, he's always worked hard his whole life. He worked at a factory that was miserable for 37 years. My grandpa worked at the same factory for 35 years. And when I tried to get on at that same factory, he blackballed me twice and I couldn't get on because he refused to let me work there. So,
but he probably did you a favor in the situation.
He did. I'm uniquely qualified for 2 things in life: making whiskey and digging ditches.
I have a really close friend of mine that came to work for us, and I work in software, but I work in agricultural software. And so the guy who started our company was a farmer, and he always joked if he ever won Powerball, he would farm until the money was gone. But in my friend's interview, the way he got the job, Rick, my old boss, he would say, what is your favorite tool to use? Because he's trying to get an idea for what it is. My friend said it's a shovel. He's like, I like a shovel because you can do just about anything with a shovel. And he talked about it for like 20 minutes. He came from a construction background, 100% got hired. He may not have been qualified for the job because he was willing to do whatever it took with a shovel. It says something about somebody. So I can appreciate that, making whiskey and digging ditches.
Yep.
All right. So I have another maybe weirdish question.
Mm-hmm.
So my journey through American Spirits. It's a video series that just came out on YouTube. Love those videos. I'm not asking a question about any of the content of the videos. In the video, you're sitting there and there's some brass thing that's in your pocket that's got a long gold chain on it.
Yeah.
What is that? What was that?
So that's an old Scottish and Irish thing. And they had them over here too, but typically in the 1800s, they were made out of glass over here. So that's what's called a dipping dog. So it's an old fashioned barrel thief, legitimately is what it is. So it's basically a piece of copper pipe with a bottom on it and a cork in the top on a chain. Drop it in the barrel, pull your sample out. In Scotland, they may still have a problem with this, I don't know, but a lot of the distillery workers, they couldn't afford the stuff they made themselves, right? So a lot of them would make those dipping dogs and keep it in their boot. And that's how they'd get their whiskey to drink on. They'd go in the warehouse and they'd pull on the sample and they'd have it in there and they could drink it. So I bought that a couple of years ago from a guy that was making them. I don't even remember where I bought it from, but occasionally if I'm going to play the Thomas Green character from Hell's Half Acre or something like that, I'll throw it in a shirt pocket just because it's a cool little conversation piece.
Hey, it caught my eye. I enjoyed it. That almost sounds like I wasn't paying attention to the videos. The videos were fantastic, but I kept waiting for that to be addressed, like what that was. And in what's out there right now, it wasn't. And I'm like, okay, I don't.
Very few people have ever asked, truthfully. Now, if I drag a Donna jug out to a demonstration, that gets attention because it's a great big hunk of copper, right? But it ain't a still, and people can look at it and go, "That's got to be distilling related," but it's not a still. What the fuck is that?
Now, is that the yeast jug?
Yep. Okay. That of all the equipment that I have, honestly, more than a still, that probably gets more questions.
Right. So you talk about capturing wild yeast, right? The idea of that, like, is this a thing that you just have always done, or is it like, hey, I want to explore what I can do with this?
So it developed a little bit more, let's say, in the past 6 years. I've always kind of done it, not so much capturing it on purpose, but like when distilling around the farm. So for a while, I had this weird obsession. I get weird about stuff like that. I'm obsessive compulsive in that, like, if I get onto something, I go down the rabbit hole and I have to see it to
All
its,
the way to the end. I
yeah,
understand.
whether it works or it doesn't work, I have to know. And so for a while when I was a kid on the farm, my thing was, I had a little 5 gallon copper pot that went along with a little 10 gallon my dad and my grandpa helped me build. And so I would take like a 5 gallon bucket and I would go to, and not only on my farm, but other farms, I would go to whatever spring that I knew of that existed. And I would say, all right, I'm going to take, just doing sugar shine. I'm just going to take, my corn and my sugar out here, this 5 gallon bucket, this 5 gallon still. I'm going to use the water out of this spring. I'm going to mash in with that water and I'm going to leave it for an open fermentation. And then I'm just going to see what happens, and does this water affect it differently? Right? Does that water affect it differently? Now, at the time, I wasn't really thinking about yeast. It didn't occur to me back then that the yeast might have been having as big of an effect as what it did. But because I wasn't pitching any yeast, and that's the way that I saw my dad and my grandpa always do it, was just open air fermentation. We were definitely getting different strains of wild yeast in different places. Now, it developed into more of actually trying to capture unique yeast strains a little later on, after, like, every old practical distiller, I learned how things work, not why they worked. And then because I speak fucking cornbread very fluently, if you're in a legal distilling situation and you start speaking cornbread, the people that put up with that shit for so long, but eventually they would like to know that you also actually have some idea of what the fuck you're doing. So then that led me into researching distilling more and more, coming across particularly a lot of early distilling manuscripts in the U.S. and some from Europe. But Harrison Hall's The Distiller. There's a book called The Practical Distiller. There's another book, I can't remember the name of it. It was published in Lexington, but it was written by a guy who started distilling in Pennsylvania and then had a distillery actually down in your neck of the woods. This was a 1808 book, I think. But he describes, for example, like the square coffin style stills that Spencer Valentine, LBL, he always thought his grandfather came up with those, but this is long before that. Somebody, for whatever reason, those stills became popular in Western Kentucky is because somebody worked at this guy's distillery and saw that design there and took it to the woods. But those books talked a lot about practical yeast propagation. Now, they didn't necessarily understand exactly what yeast was, exactly how it was working. They knew that they needed it, and they knew it had an effect on flavor. And they certainly knew that it was not easy to find a good strain. And if you found a good strain, you better fucking take good care of it. And so they describe in great detail how they did that with these Donna jugs, how important the Donna jugs were. There were two, usually in their very early days, there were 2 Donna jugs per distillery. There was one that gets carried by the distiller to and from work. It gets worked every day. It's actively working fermentations. The second one gets sealed up, tied off to a chain, thrown into a well where it's cold. There's no oxygen getting to it. And that way, if the distillery burns the fuck down, you've still got your yeast strain, because you couldn't just go and get another good strain. And that got me interested in, well, these guys, some of them went to the local brewers and got their yeast. Sometimes they'd go to the local baker and get the yeast. But these guys out in the middle of nowhere, where was their yeast?
Where did they get it from? Yeah, that's always the thing that's always sort of amazed me about the history of distilling, period, or even making spirits in general, because you've got this interaction with yeast, and I enjoy the you go by The Alchemist, right? And so to me, like, alchemy is a place where science and artistry meet. But these guys were going out and capturing yeast and creating and completing really complex scientific equations without being able to read or write their own name, right? It was just a thing that happens. And I've always sort of joked, if you were able to take, we have several big meth busts that happen here on a regular basis. If you take one of those guys, like the top tier meth cook, and you put him through college and you put him through MIT, he might cure cancer.
Right.
Because he's got the brain for it, obviously, because he's doing something super complicated. And that's what distillers are doing as well. And we're starting to understand that more and more and more. And, that was one of those things that Pat Heiss mentioned whenever he was talking. So, they have, I don't know, 20,000 strains of yeast in his Firm Solutions, and they've probably only examined a third of those or something like that. There's some that they just still, you don't know what it's going to do. It may make it taste great. It may make it taste terrible. It may be the next novel coronavirus that's going to come out of it. You don't know what the hell is going to happen.
Well, I joke with Pat when we had him on the show, and I joke around about Pat all the time because, for example, Pat loves fucking Slayer, and I love Megadeth. I like Slayer too, but I like to give Pat shit, And Pat, I may be like the anti-Pat right? Because he's from the very scientific side of things and yeast, and he and I talked about this, and I'm from the practical side of it, and I also see his side of it too, which is, he can't on a production scale that they're on now. He can't
Right.
fuck around with a lot of these yeast, because if he fucks up, he's losing 50 fucking barrels. If I fuck up, I lose 5 gallons. I'm like, whatever, right?
Yeah, his experimentation level is a little bit bigger nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. But I love doing stuff like that. And I love pushing those boundaries. And one thing I've been super excited about here lately, and this ties home distilling nowadays back to the old school practical distilling stuff. The stuff that we're seeing with craft distillers now, finally, craft distillers are talking about alternative grains. That's something that I've been doing my whole life. It's not new to me, and it wasn't new to farm distillers prior to industrialization in 1870. I mean, the spectrum of bourbon prior to 1870 was fucking massive. Right. And then industrialization narrows it down. Prohibition narrows it down to just 6, and then 3 or 4 mash bills, basically all those companies using the same yeast strain, etc. So the spectrum is there for it to be great big, be whatever you really want it to be. But what I find really exciting is, so they're finally talking alternative grain. There's starting to be little whispers about yeast, just little tiny whispers starting to come along. What really excites me as a previous home distiller / moonshiner is I still keep up with all the distilling forums, all the home distilling forums. Dude, in the next 5 to 10 years, when these guys that are into home distilling right now get into this industry, it's going to blow people's fucking minds, because the home distillers are playing with things that none of the commercial distillers have even thought about at this point.
Right. Well, they've got all the things to win and nothing to lose at that point, because they're home distilling. They don't have a brand to potentially ruin. And you may be on a smaller scale than Pat Heist, but you're still at a production scale making money. Like, the risk for the home distiller is, I made this thing, it tastes like crap, I'm going to pour it out, and I'm not going to tell anybody about it. I'm going to bury this mistake and not say a word to another human being. I'm going to try again with something different. And it's that.
And some of their stuff, what I like about what they're doing though too, is it's going to push the craft too. So there will be practical things that they can do in a commercial setting, and especially, I will tell you from an equipment point of view in particular, like, nobody's really done anything all that new or inventive with pot still for a long time. You can have all kinds of bells and whistles on a pot still, but nobody's really done a whole lot new. Home distillers are doing fucking stuff that is next level. A good example would be, and there's a couple commercial guys using it now, Chris Koenig out at Golden Beaver Distillery, Jimmy Jacks out at Bald Hills, the Tennessee Thumper, which is really a throwback in some ways to very early alchemical technology, but getting vapor and liquid distillation of botanicals while raising the proof at the same time. That's fucking cool. Or a Soxhlet extractor. Russia has a huge home distilling, so it's legal there. There's estimated to be as many as 2.5 million home distillers in Russia. There's 30-something companies making stills in Russia. And so a Soxhlet extractor, which is used for essential oil on small lab scale stills. Why did nobody ever look at that and scale it up? Well, those fucking people have. They scaled that shit up. And now limoncello doesn't take 6 months. It takes 20 minutes. That's cool shit.
We got really close to, so after I was born, my mom was like, hey, I got to get like a real education. So she went back to school and became a pharmacist, but she's really into homeopathy, alternative remedies, all of these things. And about 5 or 6 years ago, she was like, hey, what would you think if I got like a still for making essential oils? And my immediate reaction was, I'm not making any essential oils with that. That's not what all what's going to happen there. But she was interested in that, and she was wanting to do, CBD extraction or THC extraction, whatever you can do. It's fantastic. But you said a word in there, and I'm going to go back to it, because I wonder if there's a better way to go about this. So you mentioned the word craft distilling, right?
Right.
And craft distilling, I understand what it means, but most people, when they hear the word craft, they're immediately going to assume inferior product.
Right.
Craft just means different. It means that, you're not trying to chase the same thing that a major producer is, because that's ultimately not your goal. You're not working at that batch size. You're not working at that production size, and you may never be interested in that. Do you take craft as a negative term? Do you think there should be a better term? Is there a way to solve that problem of people being, because you also have these craft distilleries that like, well, we just opened up a distillery, but they never intend to distill a bottle. They're going to source all of their whiskey forever, and they're just going to call themselves a craft distillery to make a few dollars, right? So is there like an artisan label? Is there some other label we can be using?
I'm a fucking hardliner on shit like that, and so probably not the best person to ask. But like I posted on one of Mike Beach's posts the other day about his definition of craft, and Mike's definition of craft falls into everybody's basically craft, and I disagree. I don't even think that we're craft, not truthfully, not in any real meaningful way, and here's why. I think to really be a craft distiller, and now you could, I guess, at this point label us a craft distiller because we have done these two things that I consider qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
To really be a craft distiller, you almost have to be on that home distilling level. If for the very first reason, if nothing else, the first reason is you should have to take a crop from seed or plant through the growing process, be a part of that, be there with it, actually actively involved in it, harvest it, distill it, and mature it in one season, just one product, one time, and I'll consider you craft. Because then now you're understanding the whole picture of the agriculture and the labor and the distilling arts, right? Now you have some understanding of it. The second thing is your product respected, right? And so there is some questionability, in my opinion, of guys that call themselves craft that are buying in stuff. Right now, yes, there's a blending art, and that plays part in that too. But why use the word craft when you don't need to? The art's elevated enough as it is, and it can be explained. You have great blenders like Nancy Fraley. You don't necessarily need the word craft. You have guys doing cool stuff like Penelope. They don't necessarily need the word craft, in my opinion. So is your stuff respected? Is it respected by your distilling peers that are also respected? And does it get the attention of the big guys? And here's what I'll say. Well, I'm not necessarily a fan of the word craft. And while there have been a lot of shit craft whiskeys, they're getting better because the ones that were bad either got out of the business or they learned what they were doing, or they hired a home distiller. Oh, yes, weird, right? To make it for them. And I know the craft whiskey is winning to some extent. And the way that I know that is Jim Beam is dropping in a craft distillery. And I love Freddie. He's a great guy. I get along with him great, and I love seeing him do what he's doing. But when Jim Beam drops in a craft distillery, that means they're paying the fuck attention to what's happening.
But can they legitimately call that a craft distillery though? Like, and I'm not asking. Let me back up.
Yeah.
I don't think that they can. I mean, at that volume, there's a different. That becomes a marketing term for me for that type of a distiller. But what you're advocating for is like reinforcing and shoring up the foundations of what craft means, instead of saying it's a dirty word, giving it more teeth and saying like there are things that make you a crafts person. And so if you go back to I'm sorry, I'm getting some folks that are showing up that aren't supposed to be here. I gotta hide this. That's the wrong thing. Block that user. You know, you're finally doing something well whenever bots show up. Like I feel like I'm doing something good. Hey,
getting some Pornhub links going over there,
right? Yeah,
like get that affiliate payment really going on
here. You know, when they finally started showing up, it just so happens it's whenever you came, so maybe you brought them with you. But anyways, it's tough for me to accept them saying that. And you mentioned Nancy Fraley. And I'm glad you did, because going back, I was talking about the former boss that I had. He had mentioned, if he ever won Powerball, he was going to farm until all the money was gone. And somebody asked me, he's like, "Hey, what would you do if you won Powerball?" And this is about 2 years ago. And I said, first thing I would do is I would buy a distillery, and then I would try to hire Alan Bishop and Nancy Fraley, and I'd ride that shit until the money was gone or we were all rich, one or the other.
Right.
Because I feel like that's like an appropriate merging of a master blender taster and a person who's interested in the craft from beginning to end. And it would either come out fantastic, or you come up with some like amazing esoteric shit that nobody's interested in besides the people deeply in the industry. Absolutely. And all the money would be gone, but it'd be a hell of a ride.
Yeah.
What would you do?
That could work out those Iron Root Republic projects that I would like to work on with the Licorice Brothers as well then. So that'd be great, because I love those guys. I love what they're doing. So yeah, that would be great. I've had that conversation before about what would I do if I won the Powerball, and it is to some extent keep doing the same thing I'm doing, but I think it might become fuck the legal industry. I'll just go back to moonshining and pay the goddamn fines. You know,
just do it. Just thumbing your
right.
nose at the
I'm
business.
not doing it for anybody else but me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are you going to do with 5,000 gallons of whiskey? I don't fucking know, but
Well, whatever I want, that's
right.
what I'm gonna do.
I have fuck
You know,
you money. That's what I
right,
have.
yeah,
That's
I have buy a senator money at that point.
yes. Yeah. I'm giving away fucking barrels for people's birthdays.
Right. Hey, that's fantastic. So back in the fall, my family and I, we actually came up to French Lick, visited. Never been there. I have, and I'll say this: I have a predisposed distaste for the state of Indiana, and it has nothing to do with anything other than my mom has 6 sisters and 1 brother. Out of those people, inevitably, one person was going to marry somebody from Indiana. He moved down here.
Right. Kentucky has the same problem Indiana does.
Correct.
At some point, you got to go somewhere else because everybody's fucking cousins.
I married into Tennessee. I made sure that I moved out of state for a marriage. That way there was no intertwining of family trees. But that guy's sort of a jerk, right? And so you have this, you grow up knowing that's what it was. But, and he was actually from near the French Lick area. But we went up there and we did the
Is he from Jasper?
What's that?
Is he from Jasper?
No, I can't. I could tell you. If I thought deeply, I could figure it out, but they actually.
I'm going to say Du Bois or Martin County. That's what I'm going to say.
Mm-hmm. But he, anyways, we came there, visited. We went to the German restaurant in French Lick. It was super fantastic. Enjoyed the shit out of that.
Yeah.
Came by the distillery. I was able to pick up a Kasha bourbon because that's not here in Murray ever.
Right.
I do see some French Lick in the area, but that's it. Super enjoyed it, and you've talked about the Black Forest of Indiana, right? And what that is, and you like exploring and reviving history, and all of your bottles, not all, most of the bottles I've seen have some sort of a story, icon or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you've got in your pocket that you're like, someday that's the thing I want to do? And I'm not like, if you've got it, and I'm not going to tell anybody. That's fine, but.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of them, man. There's so many stories that have not been told. There's a couple coming up here shortly that aren't as personal to me, but they tie into the owners of French Lick. So there was a town that doesn't exist anymore in Martin County called Henderson Falls. So we're going to be doing a chocolate malt corn whiskey based on that. The next one that really kind of applies to me is Charles Edward Ballard, who was at one point in time Lee Sinclair's son-in-law, and he sort of took over for Lee Sinclair when Lee Sinclair passed away. And by the time that this all happened, Sinclair had basically drawn so much attention to French Lick West Baden with the dome and the game room, what we now know as a casino, that there ended up being 9 hotels and casinos in French Lick. And Charles Edward Ballard ended up owning every single one of them. None of the casinos were ever legal. Ballard owned clubs up in Michigan, out on the East Coast, down in Florida, down in the Caribbean. He owned every circus in the United States, short of Barnum and Bailey. And he would bring the circus workers and the animals back to French Lick every winter for the winter season. He was good friends with a lot of the gangsters. He helped a lot of the Kentucky distillers move their liquor through French Lick during Prohibition, because French Lick is sort of equidistant between Cincinnati, Louisville, St. Louis, Indy, even Chicago and Nashville are railroad towns pretty easily. And Ballard was such a badass legitimately that, so every distillery has their fucking Capone story, whatever. But the legit Capone story that French Lick has is that Ballard owned these 2 farms outside of town. They were about 5-6 miles out of town, Castle Knoll and Will Stem Ranch. And that's where they raised all the food for the casinos and hotels. So Capone was not allowed. This will tell you how much of a badass this guy was. Capone was not allowed in the town of French Lick or West Baden if he was not with Charles Ballard. And Capone never owned anything in French Lick or West Baden. The dude was friends with Bat fucking Masterson, and Bat Masterson gave him one of his fucking baby dragon pistols. They have it at the museum. I got to hold the fucking thing. It was. I wanted to fucking fire it so bad.
You didn't try to see if you could squeeze one off real quick and nobody would know.
It was still free, and I offered Patty, the museum curator. I was like, I've got black powder and caps in the truck. I'll fucking go get them right now.
You mean you didn't come in with it in your pocket and be like,
should have.
We're ready to go. We'll give it a shot.
Right. So yeah, that's the next one. There are a lot of so two things. So obviously your disdain for Indiana, I can understand to some extent.
It's gone mostly now, you know, because he's out of the
Yeah.
family. We had a fantastic experience. You know, I've never had a bad experience in Indiana,
Mhm.
but my kids absolutely. We did the Will Stem, you
Yeah.
know,
So you've
animal
been.
tour or whatever.
Yep.
My oldest daughter is like super into wolves, so like being able to see a real wolf
Yes.
was like the coolest shit she could ever experience. And we stayed in the cabins there, and
Yep.
you know, like the fact that there
Did
was
you
no
did you get to see the pot still?
no, we didn't get to see the pot still.
Yep. Yep.
But we
There's
came
a
in. Came into the distillery. We just had a nice, relaxing weekend, and it was fantastic because cell phone service was shit, which meant
yep.
nobody from work could get
Nobody
a hold of
bothered you.
me. And then
Exactly.
the most American thing in the world's right there as well. It's an indoor water park.
Yeah. Fuck
You know,
yeah. That's
we did all of the things. It was fantastic,
great.
right?
Yeah.
And we'll be back. You know, once she turns 13, she's like, I want to, because you know you can get in and do like an in the cage wolf experience if you're
Yep.
13 or older, and she's just 10 right now. She'll turn 11 at the end of this week. She's like, can we go back? I'm like, absolutely. You know, and
Yep.
a 13-year-old girl that's into wolves is probably sort of a weird thing, but I'm
No, it's
embrace the
cool.
weird. Let's fucking go.
Yeah, you were there at Willstem. You were within walking distance of a 400-gallon pot still. It doesn't have a head anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally within 20 feet of the old railroad track. It probably came out of the Wolf Distillery in Stampers Creek Township. And Ballard would literally, this is how ballsy he was. He'd roll the train right up to the still. It's not even in a building. And they would load the fucking train with liquor and deliver it to his clubs all over the fucking place. A lot of people don't know that's there. It's one of the last few remaining stills from the Southern Indiana Distilling Complex. But talking about Southern Indiana culture a little bit, though, the thing about the Six County region, the Black Forest region, every region of Indiana is kind of its own thing. But you know, if you talk to somebody from Indiana, you say, "Hey, where are you from?" You know, if somebody says I'm from Indiana, they're typically talking like Columbus North, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you say, "Where are you from?" and somebody says Southern Indiana, it's almost its own fucking state, especially anything from, let's say, Perry/Orange County going east over to Scott County, maybe even Brown County. Brown County is maybe a little more progressive, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one thing I love about the region I'm in, and the Black Forest in general, the Six County region, which is Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Crawford, Harrison, and Perry. I love the culture here. I love that there's still most of the people who originally settled here were from the earliest wave of German immigrants into the United States, and they brought really old ways with them and very old superstitions and very old thoughts. They're hard to find nowadays, but they do still persist if you know where to look for them at.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also there's a certain darkness that comes along with that too that I really enjoy, and I like being able to play off of. And to me, I can more than anywhere else. Well, not more than anywhere else, but the main place that you can find it available as a tourist is French Lick. That town has it. That town does not feel like it belongs in Indiana.
Oh, absolutely not. I don't know where it belongs specifically. It just doesn't.
Southern Georgia. That's where it should be.
See, you know, I've spent a deal of time in Savannah. We do, you know, vacations in that area, and I don't know. There's some sort of almost East European vibe to French Lick in itself,
Yep.
at least in my interpretation. You know, just
Yeah.
It's unique, and we super enjoyed it. Like I said, we will absolutely be back. And we were talking about what we're going to do for spring break. Are we going to do anything for next fall break? And the kids are like, we can go back to French Lick. And you know, I've always been there. Let's go experience another thing and another thing and another thing or whatever. But I'm like, I don't know. Maybe we will go back. You know, it's a unique environment. So you like to write these stories that kind of go along with it. That creative process, what does that look like? Do you wait until you taste the spirit to match the story, or do you make and distill the spirit and put it in the barrel expecting it to match like how do you connect the bottle to the story?
It kind of depends on what the product is. So like Lee Sinclair was named long before there was Lee Sinclair. That's literally what I called my moonshine, was Lee Sinclair. So it's basically the same mash bill as the mash bill. A variation upon the mash bill that I came up with when I was 15. And Lee Sinclair, of course, being not from Washington County, but living the majority of his adult life in Washington County and then going to Orange County to start up the Dome, me being from Washington County, etc., being very familiar with Sinclair, the places he grew up at, the friends that he had, the circles he ran in, it made sense. Plus, we're right across from the Dome. We're on Sinclair Street. It's in the town that he built. That had to be called Sinclair. It made absolute sense. Matty Gladden, I knew that I wanted to use the name of because the story's too good not to tell. I didn't necessarily know what I was going to use it for. And it just so happened to turn out that High Rye bourbon worked because of all the whiskeys we make, it's the biggest and boldest of all of those whiskeys. And so it's going to grab some attention. And so that story needed a platform. That story, would have made its own platform, even if it was on a shit whiskey. But I wanted it, because it was named after a woman, to be a fucking great whiskey that was big and bold and challenged what your perceptions of what a high rye bourbon should be. And so it fit. Solomon Scott, to some extent, which we've only released as a single barrel so far, which is our rye whiskey. It'll come out this year. It'll be bottled and bond, but it'll be 5.5, maybe 6 years old by the time it comes out. We kind of did that because one of the distilleries that Solomon owns was the Scott and McCoy distillery, and they made rye whiskey there. And it was very similar mash bill to what Solomon Scott is. So in the Ohio Valley, 60% rye throughout southern Indiana, southern Ohio, and northern Kentucky was very, very common. So that fit more so than the stories. So I have a lot of these stories, and sometimes I do have products in mind, and there's a lot of stories again in the future that I do have built up that I will use for products, including the very first gentleman who figured out how to cheat the gauging tank, who also happened to be the gentleman who came up with the patent for the gauging tank. And they made the mistake of making him an excise man who also owned a distillery. So that story's coming. That was in Patoka, Indiana. Not Patoka Lake, but actual Patoka out by Evansville, interestingly enough. More so than the stories go into particular products, if I'm going to develop a product, and I've always done this at home, I want it to have a particular feel to it. A lot of this ties in like supernatural, spirituality, stuff like that for me. All those things are tied together closely. So I'll make a playlist. And alongside that playlist, I'll also have maybe a color in mind. And then that color and that music will remind me of a particular feeling that I had somewhere. And then I build off of that to try to create some of these things. Now, it's not as strict as that. It's not like come up with an idea. Here's a rough idea of a mash bill. It wasn't quite close enough to what I wanted. Usually I'm close enough in the ballpark. I only have to ever make something once or twice before I feel like I'm where I want it to be at. I'm not so much of a perfectionist that if I get stuck on something, I'm going to get bored with it. So, I mean, at this point, I've distilled so many batches of fucking Lee Sinclair, and I love that whiskey, but I'm tired of distilling Lee Sinclair,
See, well, maybe you wouldn't have worked out in the factory after all, because, we have a small engine plant. We had a small engine plant from Briggs and Stratton here in town, and I worked that for a summer. And man, that was I worked as a janitor at a university cleaning up just the worst things. Far better than working in a factory because I couldn't do the repetitive behavior or whatever. But I always enjoy anything that comes with a story. Like, I think it enhances the connection, and you sort of describing your creative process makes it that much better. There are brands out there that are slightly, we'll say more than slightly dishonest about their history and connecting it with the bottle. I think most really in tune whiskey consumers kind of go in knowing that some of the story is bullshit, and you're not trying to connect the story to the bottle like that. You're connecting in a different way, which is fantastic. And I absolutely appreciate that.
No. And I consider myself, not sorry to interrupt, but as much of a historian as I am a distiller. So anything we put on the bottle, and I'm not saying that sometimes we won't get stuff wrong. History is what it is. It gets updated all the time. But I want that story on the bottle to be as legit as what it is. And just like you, I don't like it when people do that shit. There's a brand here in Indiana that has done that with a distiller that was from the 6 county region. William Dalton is a direct response and shots fired to that particular fucking brand. Because if you're going to tell that story, get it the fuck right. And let me tell you, 99 corn and 1% malt is not approximate to what they were fucking making at that distillery, and the tax records are accessible for you to figure that the fuck out.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a situation where they took the story and they created the whiskey to match it, as opposed to what you're doing, which is super interesting. I've got the Maddie Gladden, I have Sinclair, I have Solomon Scott, I have Kasha. Man, when's the Lost River going to be available?
Fucking Lost River shit.
Sorry, you don't have to answer that. When you agreed to come on, that was the first question that I wrote down. Like, I have to ask this question just because I've heard your reaction to it elsewhere. That's
Kevin Rose has fucking nailed me with that Lost River thing so many times, and so I will tell you the story of what happened here. So Lost River will be out. It'll be very limited because we didn't make much of it. Because honestly, it's either a 7 or an 8 grain bourbon. I don't remember.
I think it's labeled as a 6 grain.
Yeah, maybe it is. I can't remember. Maybe I'm counting Kasha and buckwheat as 2 different grains. It was up there. It was a lot. There's a lot happening. I'll put it that way.
Yep. It's
not that it's a bad whiskey. It's that it's very hard to balance that many grains and be able to pick those individual flavors out. And so it wasn't my idea. It's hard to be passionate about things that aren't my idea.
Right.
And that's selfish, but I feel like I've, to some extent, as a distiller, I fucking earned that at this point, right?
Yeah.
So the whiskey is what I have of that whiskey, of that bourbon, is coming along. It's just going to take a little more time in the barrel. And so what happened was we had a barrel that was pretty good, and I was pretty happy with it. And so Liquor King has done so much business with us down in Texas. I was like, all right, they want something unique. They're always looking for something new. They want the next thing that we're doing. We'll give them Lost River. Now, it never occurred to me, because I don't fucking think this way, that people would be pissed off that I used a local landmark for a whiskey that ended up in Texas, right? And they would be coming to the distillery like pissed that they saw this label online. People who aren't even going to drink the fucking whiskey. They just want it because it has fucking Lost River on it, right? And would be legitimately pissed that they drove to the distillery. Instead of reading the post that said it was only available in Texas, they'd be legitimately pissed that they drove to the distillery to get Lost River and it wasn't fucking there, right? And so this came out in Texas on, I think I was off for like 3 or 4 days or something like that. I took a Friday and a Monday or something. And I had a bunch of shit I was trying to knock out on the farm. And this came out and my phone starts blowing up. And it's people fucking messaging me pissed off that they can't get it. Work is calling me and going, when are we going to put that out in the tasting room? And I just turned my phone off. I'm just fucking, fuck you motherfuckers. It's my time off. Leave me alone. So then I started telling Kevin, I was like, you know where you can get Lost River at? You can only fucking get it in fucking Texas and Mississippi, because now I'm making sure it never comes out in Indiana.
Yeah. I enjoyed the interchange around that one specifically, because when I don't know if somebody shared it or I saw it from, I don't know where it came from, but I saw it come across. Oh, cool. I wonder if they'll have that, at the distillery at some point in time, because that's the only place I could find the Kasha.
Right.
And it wasn't the only reason I came. And it wasn't one of those things where if it wasn't there, I'd be like, oh, well, I wasted my time. No, because there's innumerable other things to pick up there. And I didn't go with a single purpose. And if I had gone with a single person, I would have called ahead of time, been like, hey, you guys got this? I'm like, no, we don't. Well, shit, and I'm not going to drive 4 hours up there to get it or whatever. But I was like, yeah, I got to ask that question, because
had I known that was literally going to be like that big of a moment where I could have purposely trolled people, I would have been on top of that shit. But it didn't fucking occur to me. Like when we did Unpretentious and I made up all the bullshit about the secondary market and people were buying into that shit, right? That was the most fun I ever fucking had. When I put up
is that you unintentionally trolled the entire bourbon world. That's
right.
How
but then it backfires because your phone just fucking blows up, right? You trolled yourself at this point,
Where can I get it, Texas? Where can I get it, Texas?
And I'm continuously surprised by some of these things though too. So like the some of the one-off stuff we've done at the distillery. So the Unpretentious was the first one, and that went fucking crazy. And then the Right Way, which was the rye finished in absinthe barrel, and that went really well. We still got quite a bit of that because we did 3 or 4 barrels of it. And then we did no, we don't have any of that. I'm sorry, that sold really quick. The absinthe finished in New American Oak is still some there, which absinthe's slow seller anyways.
Right.
But like the complexity, the apple brandy and fucking tequila barrel, which is cool. That's stuff that excites me. It was an apple brandy distilled as basically as like a white spirit, no heads, no tails, full on into a used tequila barrel, matured 100% for 3 years in a tequila barrel. I bottled it at 145.1, which is fucking, somebody's making babies that they don't want. That's what's happening at 145.1, right? And I thought, so what happened was NES Group picked that, and they wanted it at that proof, but they only wanted half the barrel. And I was like, well, fuck it, we'll put the other part out in the tasting room, and it'll probably, we'll sell a bottle or two here and there. Gone in fucking 2 days. And I'm like, who fucking knew that there was a market for fucking hazmat apple brandy? I didn't know that that existed.
Hazmat apple brandy that tastes like sort of like tequila. Is that what we're getting at? That's that's bourbon and whiskey specifically is getting like super crowded. At least it feels like everybody's there. And I think we're all asking the question. I know Bourbon Lens joined, and I know we've had that conversation. He and I have had that conversation. I don't know if it's Scott or Jake. It could be either one of them. What's next? Like, what's the next big spirit in North America, do you think? Is everybody going to shift to like brandy or rum? Is it agave? Is it cognac or Armagnac? Is it American single malt? Or is it going to be everybody's going to go back to fucking vodka?
So I think the next thing that is logical is American single malt. You're already seeing that. I think that rye also still has a lot of room to grow. And a lot of bourbon drinkers say that they don't like rye. But the truth is they don't like MGP 95.5. Right.
They don't even know. They've had one rye, because I'm guilty of this, 100% guilty of this. I had a rye 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm like, I don't really like rye, because it was one that was very licorice forward.
Yep.
I don't like licorice. The closest I can get to licorice is like Whorehound candy.
Yep.
And I'm okay with that, because it's like a place between root beer and licorice. And I'm like, okay, Whorehound's fine, but I didn't like that particular one. And then I made it a point last January. I was like, all right, I'm going to try a different rye every day for like 30 days. Found out I like a lot of ryes. I just didn't like the one that I had, and I formed my whole opinion on it. I think that's what most bourbon drinkers are doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think most rye people, again, are familiar with MGP 95.5, or most people who've tried rye don't like it, MGP 95.5 or Sazerac, right? That's their experience. And there's a lot more out there, but it's just now growing. Ours is at 60% rye, which is different than Kentucky and MGP.
Right.
I think there's a lot of
intentional. Is that so you can differentiate, so you don't get lumped in with MGP and get mistaken for it?
That was a lot of it. And then the other part of it was I got invited to go to the Mount Vernon George Washington distillery for a week several years ago. And it's same proportion mash bill as what they do at Mount Vernon, but we switch out a few different things as far as the malt, the yeast, etc. So it's not George Washington's rye, obviously. It's its own separate entity. But the other reason is because that 60% rye mash bill, again, that's what was popular in the Ohio Valley in the early 1800s. Ironically, aged in hickory wood, of all things, which is kind of interesting. So there's a lot of levity left in rye. Single malt is got a lot of room to grow, and I think in 4 or 5 years, we're already talking about single malt now. Everybody keeps bringing it up, and I hope it doesn't fall into the rum thing where, everybody brings it up, but it never really catches on. I think single malt has a lot more levity because, especially with these different roasted malts, different maltsters that are out there, the different types of malt, and you can malt any grain. I mean, a single malt whiskey in the United States could be 100% malted corn. Right.
And until TTB does something.
Yeah.
It says it has to be something else. That's what it'll be. And that may be coming. Like, I know they've been teasing that for 3 months now. And I think it was supposed to be December when they made a decision. They still haven't made one. But so is Alan Bishop going to make a single malt rye or American single malt?
So there's already a few single malts in the warehouse. Not much. We only do a batch or two here and there. I have some projects up my sleeve that involve, let's say, single malts and also much higher malt proportions in general in whiskeys that I'm super excited about that I can't quite talk about just yet, but people will know when they know, and it'll be, in my opinion, a pretty big deal, I think.
Yeah, just give me some general vague timelines so that way I can go ahead and plan my time off and get my cabin and make sure that we're up in the French Lick area so we can pick it up.
Let's say that same timeline where single malt becomes a bigger part of the conversation, that 3 to 4 year range is where that'll be at. I think that apple brandy has a lot of levity. Now, it's never going to be huge because there's not enough apples to do anything with, right? And there's a lot of really, really shitty apple brandy in the United States right now, unfortunately. But I do think that well-made apple brandy, apple brandy is the sexier older sister of bourbon. It's not a hard jump for a bourbon drinker to get into apple brandy and like what they are tasting. If it's made right and it's made a little heavier and a little bolder in style, like what we do with our Hoosier apple brandy. But I really think where things are going is sort of back to that pre-industrialization sort of thing. So now you're getting enough craft distilleries that you can have regional craft distilleries that actually play into the local food shed, the local watershed, use local ingredients, use local yeast. Every distillery in the United States, I don't give a shit if you're in Alaska. There are corn varieties that will grow in Alaska. If you are going to make a whiskey with corn in the United States, you should have your own corn variety. There are literally thousands of them. Every distillery should have their own. Every distillery should have their own yeast variety. I think people's palates are maturing. They're coming around to interesting, fun, new things and new ideas. So I think where the real market for craft distilling is, in my opinion, is not so much single categories, but distilleries that could turn on a dime, do a ton of fucking different things, hit categories that you've never heard of that existed back before Prohibition, such as a split brandy. So split brandies were literally half grain, half brandy. So you'd have peach and wheat, you'd have rye and apple, that sort of thing. Botanical spirits, I think, still have a lot of room and a lot of levity out there. Very old styles of whiskey, definitely. There's some interesting stuff there I can't talk about just quite yet because I want everybody to know about those things. I will tell you what I'm drinking right now. It's homemade, and I can't say who made it, but it is an apple brandy that has elements of apple smoke as well as peat smoke. So it's a smoked apple brandy, which is
peat. So apple smoke, as in like apple wood smoked.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't know that there's another way to like burn an apple, but
no.
I figured if there was, Alan Bishop figures out how to.
Yeah. Yeah, man. We've been calling this Lefrog. So, it's Lefroy, but it's just Frenchy enough. You have to throw frog in there.
Right. Okay. So for an apple brandy novice, is an aged apple brandy the way to go, or is just clear apple? Like, where do you start with apple brandy?
It really depends. I think for bourbon people, definitely an aged apple brandy is the way to go. Laird's has got some good stuff. If you're going to buy anything from Laird's, stay away from, in my opinion, the Applejack. And I respect the hell out of Laird's. I love them. But just as far as quality goes, I'd go for their older expressions. They're pretty good. Hubert Robin. Hubert Robin. Any of their single varietal apple brandies, they're expensive, but they are fucking top notch, excellent. Calvados is a good place to start, and you can get some good Calvados for decent prices. We obviously have our 2-year-old Old Clifty Hoosier apple brandy, and we're about to roll out with this. Was supposed to be out back in the fall, and we couldn't get bottles, and we also couldn't get label approval at the time for whatever reason. But we have a 4-year-old bottled and bond apple brandy that we're going to be rolling out this year that was in both new oak barrels and 64-gallon hogshead barrels. So once used bourbon barrel staves on the side, new American oak on the ends. I'm actually getting ready to drop some apple brandy into, ironically, some used Lefroy casks. So that's going to be fun. I'm on this apple and smoke thing because I don't know why. Because
it makes sense. I mean,
right, it just seems like it should work.
Any fan of barbecue is like, okay, I see how this works.
Yep.
Right. That's exactly where you're at, because how many barbecue sauces have like applesauce as a base, and you're talking about smoking it over any type of wood at any point in time. Like, I'm here for it, and yes.
Now, I want to say one more thing about apple brandy too, real quick. When you do try apple brandies, give them a little levity. Try 2 or 3 of them, because again, there's a lot of bad apple brandy out there. There's some good producers too, obviously, like we just talked about. But a lot of people make one of 2 mistakes with apple brandy. There's more heads on brandy run in general. And those heads in apple brandy can be very deceiving. So they can come off as almost like red raspberry. And a lot of people make the mistake of leaving way too much of them in there. The other thing that tends to happen is they tend to run a little too far into the tails with apple brandy, and they don't pick up on the vegetative thing. So just bear in mind, you may have to try 2 or 3 of them before you find a good one. don't pay more than $100 for an apple brandy. I say this about bourbon too. Don't pay more than $100 for a bottle, guys. This is supposed to be blue collar stuff.
I think at the end of the day, the only way I'm spending more than $100 on a bottle of bourbon, at least right now, is if it's a dusty. If it's something from the 70s, 80s, I'll consider it, because at that point in time, we're looking at an antiquity that somebody has saved over time that could end up tasting like a shoe, or it could be sort of a different spirit, because, I've been into woodworking in my life, and I know that the wood that was available to them when they were aging that was older growth wood with different ring patterns and different densities. And so the way the whiskey interacts is significantly different than what you might get now. So I can see value there, but why spend more than $100 when there's tons of fantastic whiskey that's below $100?
Well, I got something that will, it's a proposed project that I'm doing, playing around with bench scale stuff on rapid aging. This won't be rapid aged by the time I actually do the thing, but I'm just playing. So you being a woodworker, what if I told you that 3 to 4 year time frame we just talked about will include the following: a whiskey and or an apple brandy aged in barrels where either, at the very least, the heads will be made of this, and potentially the barrels if they can make staves out of it. Nobody knows for sure yet because nobody's done this. But I have access to oak logs from Missouri, virgin oak that's 170 years old.
You're going to have something drastically different than what most people can do.
Yep.
At least from my understanding, my very limited understanding, like Buffalo Trace went on that really long experiment with the the Buffalo Trace single oak project, where they selected different trees and they did different ring patterns and they did all kinds of different stuff. And, they found there's difference, and whether it's the single barrel part or the wood sort of is left to be kind of guessed at. But from a woodworking perspective and understanding how wood how wood behaves based off of its age, if someone cuts a 180-year-old tree down and they, sawmill it into lumber, it's less likely to cup because that grain pattern is different, because it's going to lose moisture at a different rate. It's not going to curl up nearly as quickly because it's not young. It wasn't grown.
Now, this is, check this out. This is the cool part. So this is 170-year-old. It was cut 170 years ago. Oh. It's from a fucking log cabin. Literally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
when I said virgin oak, I mean like it was virgin oak back then.
Yeah, right. No, I didn't know if like somebody dove deep back into the woods and found a 180-year-old tree and they were cutting it down.
Yeah.
So when is this for sale?
We got to see what the cooperage can do with it too, because
if they can.
I knew that I had them on the hook for this Zach cooperage, because there's 3, father, son, grandfather all involved, and I usually call and talk to the son. And as soon as I said 170-year-old oak from a log cabin in Missouri, all 3 of them were on the phone. right? They're like, we don't know what we can do with it, but we're willing to
give it a hell of a shot. Absolutely.
Yep.
And I can only imagine when they go to start cutting that tree up, they've got to be super nervous, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because there's only one shot at this. It's like when you put in a kitchen countertop and you're going to go cut the sinkhole, you can only cut one sinkhole. And once it's there, if you screwed it up to the left or the right, it is what it is. That's where they're at with that tree. But with that log specifically, you might be able to find another old tree, old log. Sourcing that particular material.
Yeah, there's not a lot of that out there.
No, there's not.
What's crazy about it is doing these bench tests and getting the wood in from the guy. When you cut this stuff, of course it's weather checked on the outside. The inside of it's pristine. There's no insect damage. There's no nothing. It smells gorgeous. Just hitting it with a MAP gas torch to do some light toasting and some char on some little pieces, just to, again, rapid aging, just to get an idea of what the aromatics would be off of it. You could still see the lignin draw up. There was actually still some wood sugar in there. It actually boiled a little sugar out of the end of it. And I was like, man, we have to, even if this turns out to be shit, I have to know. I mean,
you got to see it through to the end. I mean, you mentioned earlier that, you're OCD about stuff, but what you're really describing to me is a scientific process. Like you've got to go all the way to the end of the experiment to see what comes out the other end. And it could be complete crap, or it could be one of the most amazing things. And you may end up with that barrel of whiskey that's worth millions because nobody can recreate it,
Yeah.
And that's So that's the thing whenever I say, hey, is there any project that you're working on that would be super interesting in the future? I don't have to ask that question now because you just gave it to me.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I figured
super
that one's easier to throw out there because it's a little.
right.
I'm protective about a lot of things because
Right.
I've seen people take my ideas and run with them, and I don't mind to share things with people, but sometimes when they take it and then they claim it, pisses me off. That one's a little easier to talk about because I don't see anybody else making the phone call tomorrow, like calling people like, you know, where there's a 170-year-old log cabin at that I can,
Right.
that
Yeah,
I
and
can get hold of.
somebody may hear that, and I can absolutely see, somebody finding an old distilling site and be like, "Oh, well, we found a cabin on an old distilling site, and we're gonna try." And that's an interesting story in and of itself. But lucky for you, only about 17 people watch this, so the odds of this getting to someone to try to
Yeah.
steal the idea pretty limited. You don't have to
Now,
worry about that here.
here's a fun little part of that story too, though. I'll add a complication to those who would like to also replicate this. And this was not only my idea. I had a friend, and he's going to get all the credit in the world when this comes out, who's getting me the logs and did the work and the whole thing. This ties into the spirituality of the whole thing with distillation too and alchemy. So again, those things are all related to me. Find a 170-year-old log cabin from the Ozarks that also had a murder happen in it, and then get back to
me. What you talking about? Like a murder that happened in it years and years ago,
yes,
or
back in the 1800s. Yeah,
I was like, because like you could just find that cabin and then you can go get somebody murdered, and now you fulfill the whole story here. But that's just a lot of dedication. That
it really is. There's dark arts, and then there's just being an asshole.
No, there's dark arts, and then there's just being a murderer. That's all that is. It's like there's discovering the history, and then there's just being a creep.
I haven't said this in a long time, but I used to say that distilling is it's 60% hard science, all the shit that you can't argue with. You can turn it upside down, do it backwards. As long as you don't poison anybody, you make good product, you've done your job. It's 30% dark arts, and then it's 10% intuition. The 10% keeps you from blowing yourself up, and the 30% dark arts is all the bullshit marketing that happens in between. Mm-hmm. You just added 5% more to that, which is now distilling is turning it up to 11.
Hey, all right, but I would assume, given the competitive nature of many marketplaces, there's people out there that probably willing to take it to that level,
Oh man, there really are. Yeah, I've seen it happen so many times, and I don't mind to help people, and I used to help everybody. Anybody would call me, I would help them, and whatever I could.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
But I have learned my fucking lesson on that deal, and there's still some guys that I'll help, especially home distillers and stuff like that. I'm a little more careful on the commercial side of things, and I've gotten a lot more comfortable with saying, "What are you going to fucking pay me?"
Right. Your time and your experience is worth something. And that's one of the things that specifically, or at least I've seen from people that are either entrepreneurs or they come from a home distilling or a home brewing background. They don't value their own time significantly enough because they come from a cooperative nature. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I have a skill set and it is worth something. And so you should pay me.
In this world too, you see, this goes back to that home distiller thing. One of the things that I absolutely hate about this industry is seeing the number of distillers who are great distillers, make great product, and they're great faces for their company, and then they get fucked because they don't own anything, right? Or people can't manage the company because they don't know what they're doing, or they're lazy, or they don't care, and they don't cut these people in. What would be better? Give these people whatever menial raise that you're going to give them, or give them a little piece of the company so they actually feel like they have something and some involvement in it. And that happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're a part of the original, we built this from nothing.
Yep.
It's tough to get a piece of that. And that's, like the last company that I used to work for, they were an entrepreneurial startup, and it was the two owners. But no one else got a piece of that. And so when they sold the company, they got it. And that's fine because they're the ones that put their lives, their livelihoods, their farms on the line for it. I get that. But when you transition to that, you don't get the same degree of connection with the work. Like you could give somebody a raise that could equal what piece of the business you're going to give them. But if you give them a piece of the business, now they're tied to that work more so. I mean, like your blood, sweat, and tears are going into what you make. Yeah. But if you have ownership in it, it's even more so. Yeah. It makes those I got to work 80 hours this week feel a little softer.
Yeah.
when you have skin in the game.
Absolutely. Well, and then the other side of that too is a lot of times these companies, they either don't understand the art of distillation, they don't understand anything about the business. Maybe they don't hire the positions that they need to hire. And obviously, when you start off, it's hard to do that. But you can also be a little lazy about things. And the problem with being small is, Joe Herron used to say this a lot while I worked at Copper and Kings. And even though Joe and I didn't get along on a personal basis very well, we get along fine now. When I worked for him, it wasn't fucking happening. But there were all kinds of Joeisms he'd say all the time. So one of them was about playing soccer, right? So you either have big slow guys or small fast guys, but you don't have any small slow guys, right? Because they're just going to get fucking destroyed.
Right.
And the distilleries that are going to go out of business, you can have great you can have great products and great stories. If you don't have good marketing and you're not fast about what you do, you're going to fucking go out of business one way or the other. You're not going to make it. It's just not going to happen, period. One of the other things that Joe said that stuck with me, probably gave me a complex, honestly, was procrastination is like masturbation. They both feel good at the time, but you're really just fucking yourself. Right. That's the greatest.
And you sort of feel shamed afterwards, right?
Yes, absolutely. Or treading water is the same as drowning. You're just fucking doing it slower.
Right. Yeah. You're being less efficient at the drowning. No, you're absolutely right. I think I only have let's look, maybe one question left.
All right.
I only have one question left, but we can talk for however long you want to.
Yeah,
But I also know we've been running for an hour and a half, and I want to be aware of your time and not take.
Yeah, man, I gotta go watch fucking Moonshiners so I can get my blood pressure up over whatever stupid thing they're doing on there this week.
Okay, so you may appreciate this. Last night I caught myself. We don't have cable TV here at the house. We haven't. My children have never known what that is.
That's awesome.
It's not overt, like we're not anti whatever. We have an Apple TV, we have YouTube TV, we have Disney Plus, all that shit, so we can see Sophia and whatever that the princess is. But I was sitting on the couch last night, and I trust the YouTube algorithm to give me what I'm going to watch, because I watch enough things that it's probably going to be all right, whether it's just some random stuff. But last night it was a PBS episode of someone opening up a time capsule. It was like a people in an office, like they were like forensic archaeologists or something. They were opening a time capsule, and my wife and I both sat there and literally just screamed at the TV on how they should be opening this copper box like we knew what the fuck we were doing.
Right.
Yours is a little different because you do know what you're doing when it comes to distilling, but both of our blood pressure was through there. Finally, she got up and left the room. She's like, I don't need this stress in my life. I don't know anything about archaeology, but I know how they're cutting apart that copper box is wrong and stupid, and I can't deal with this anymore. And so, this one may be a softball. Something that most bourbon fiends, or whiskey fiends specifically, obsess about that just really doesn't fucking matter.
Whew, man. Okay, I'll give you
a bunch of them. So that I know you're probably not like having difficulty coming up with one. It's like narrowing down all of them to one.
Yes. So okay, I have two that I have to do. So one is,
you can give me as many as you want to. I just threw out one so that way you don't have to give all.
One is a quality issue, and that's the age thing, right? Because there's a difference between age and maturity, right?
Right.
And if you listen to a true distiller, and I still slip into it sometimes, but you listen to somebody, what I would consider a true distiller who's into the art, they don't say I age whiskey. They say I mature whiskey, because there's a fucking difference, right? And that we're getting over that at this point now. If you're stupid and you stand in line for fucking hours for a fucking bottle taste, goddamn, I wish one time I could get you fucking people on one product to come to my fucking distillery in the middle of fucking nowhere and stand in a fucking line for 2 or 3 days. Because I swear to you, I would come and I would just troll the fuck out of all of you. I would come in on my day off to fuck with you, because I think it's fucking stupid. The one that I have a hard time reconciling, and I don't understand, I've never understood. It's not as it can be. It's not as bad at the distillery as it was at the distillery at Copper and Kings, because obviously more people come through there. But it certainly happens at events, and it happens on Facebook, and it happens on social media a lot. there's a weird obsession with who makes your whiskey right now. Granted, there should be some of that because you want to know that they're putting the time and the effort, etc., into this, right? But there's almost this celebrity culture that's grown up around the whiskey distilling industry, which I find very fucking strange. My dad built fucking furniture for 37 years. He worked on the custom side of Kimball's and Borden. He built furniture for the White House, for the fucking president, for Congress, etc. Not once did anybody ever come ask him for a fucking autograph. I mean, that would be like the equivalent of him sticking some chewed up gum underneath the fucking desk. There's my fucking mark. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I don't mind this, to do that kind of thing, but there is also this weird and I guess because it is within the circles of people who are really into this, it is a little bit of a sort of pseudo celebrity thing where it's almost like people start to demand your time and they start to expect that you will take time out of your day to deal with them. And they want you to deal with them in such a way that you guys have been friends since the beginning fucking time, even if you don't know each other. And just like everything else in the world, if you have a difference of opinion with them, if I post something on Facebook that's controversial, they're going to be the first motherfuckers that jump on there and say some shit. Right.
Like, how could you say this thing that I
I've somehow I've smacked it I've smacked them in the fucking face, and I've sullied their fucking existence and our friendship. And how could you? We've known each other for 2 months. I don't like that at all, and that's why there are people that I've made friends in the industry, and I've got a lot of friends in the industry, and I love all of them, and I appreciate all the people who like our whiskey. I absolutely fucking do. I couldn't make a living doing this if they didn't support it, right? Why do you fucking care who makes your fucking whiskey? Why do you think that you have to be fucking close fucking friends with them? Why do you think that they're any different than you are? I wake up every morning and I shit in a pot of clean drinking water like everybody else does. Listen, I'm sitting here right now with like a knee that looks like a softball. I don't know what I did. It's possibly a sex injury. It could be. I don't know, right?
Right.
I'm a normal fucking dude. I sneezed on my way to work one time, pulled a muscle in my neck, and couldn't turn my head to the left. I struggle just like you fucking people do, right?
Pulled my hamstring in this office chair about 6 months ago. I understand what you're saying.
Like I said, I'm uniquely qualified for two things. If I wasn't making whiskey, I'd be digging fucking ditches. And so that celebrity culture thing, I don't understand that, and I'm guilty of it too. Like, I like it when music celebrities get a bottle of our whiskey, but I look at that a little bit differently. I look at that as like, oh, cool, they made art that I enjoyed for years, and one of them has now tried something that I've made and said something about it. It's cool. It's like returning the favor, right?
Right. Yeah. You feel like you're a part of it. I think I try to be aware of that perception myself. Not that I have that, but whenever I deal with people that do have that, modern.
And you don't strike me that way at all. You fucking laid back and cool, and you asked fucking great questions that were fun to answer. There was no awkwardness. There was no weirdness. And you know what you didn't do the whole time that I fucking love? And this is the people that I become friends with. This is how they are. You didn't name drop one fucking time about any other fucking distiller the whole time that we were.
Well, luckily, I don't have any other distillers that I've talked to, but I would generally, I take that back. I said Todd Leopold at the beginning, but that was literally just me saying, like, those are my favorite episodes of the Distillers Talk.
And that doesn't count either. Like, Leopold doesn't count as name dropping. He I guess he could now to some extent, but because I know that Todd is a normal person and a good person, I don't consider, like, somebody mentioned that, like, it could have been like Todd would be popular if he were a school teacher. He's got
that personality, and absolutely he's on my list of people that I want to talk to. But modern consumers, they want to have a deeper connection with the things that they consume, and it's because we have that information available to us. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, hell, 20 years ago, we didn't have the ability to get all the information about everything at the drop of a hat. We could get some things, but not a ton. But there's this obsession with it. But then there's also comes that celebrity factor. And, it's like, Jack Hood Sommelier.
Oh, fuck yeah. Yeah.
So I love Jack, but, I only knew him from Instagram. And I was, 6 months ago, I was going to be in Omaha for work. And I was like, hey, what are some whiskey bars I should hit up? Like, where should I go? And he's like, no, you're not going anywhere. Come see me. And I'm like, I'm not trying, like, this is where you live. This is your family. I don't want to be that person.
Yeah, but he got a good vibe from you, and he invited you, and that's cool.
Yeah, and so I went over and absolutely had a fucking blast.
Yep.
You know, I didn't take a single picture. I didn't do like I took pictures for myself because I got to try some scotch that I'm never gonna fucking see ever. You know, like it was a great time, and I enjoyed the time that I had. Got to hang out with him and his brother, and you know, meet his now fiance, I guess. Fantastic. But like while I was at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, you see different people. And, you know, people are like, oh, you know, let me get your autograph. Let me do this. Let me do that. And I want to be like, I appreciate what you're doing. I stopped by the Neely family. Like, I really like what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
But I'm also not trying to be like, hey, you owe me something. All you owe me is what's in this bottle that you produced that I paid for. And
Absolutely.
that's it. That's the end of the story. Everything after that is just icing on the cake.
You know, my other favorite one is, and this didn't start happening until last year. Of course, we started to get some success, and you know, I came to Spirits of French Lick with a lot of connections I met through Copper and Kings, and I can honestly say we have never paid for any reviews. We've never paid for any of that kind. We've paid to be in competitions and stuff, obviously, which everybody does, but we've never.
You have to. There's not a way to do it otherwise.
Yeah, but everything else has been organic. Whatever anybody has said about us has been organic, and so the Minnick thing comes up a lot because obviously Minnick has been pretty big on us, and it's always like. It always starts innocently enough. Like a question will come up about Minnick, and then maybe somebody will roll their eyes, or maybe somebody will make a fucking McKenna joke or whatever. And then it's like, because they know that he gave us some gas, right? And he got and by all means, I'm not the right person to ask that question, anyways. And Fred will tell you this. He and I, when we first met, fucking oil and water. There was no none, right? And Fred has always been incredibly honest about everything that he's ever tasted of ours. There's things that he's been like, I mean, Matty Gladden, he tasted it on a show, and I think what he literally said about was, "That's a hot tamale," right? Okay, sure, right? And I appreciate that because it's not his thing. But there's always this, like, once that conversation starts, the past 2 years, it becomes, so what's the inside baseball on Fred Minnick, right? Like they think that that I've paid Fred, or that the company's paid Fred, or that me and Fred are like, and sometimes we do talk. We've become pretty good friends, honestly. Right. I like Fred a lot. I think he's actually a good guy, but they seem to think that it's like either we paid them or you're going to go hang out with them this weekend, you know?
Right.
And
like he either did it as a favor or as somebody paid you, and not giving you the legitimate credit that you deserve for making.
And that's the insulting part of it, right? Is not only that you're just presuming shit about Fred to begin with, but now you have implied that my whiskey wasn't worthy of what.
The only way it would happen is if you gave him money or you were his friend. Like that's the only way it's going to work. And that's super insulting. And you know, the way I've always looked at it, because, you know, this is a thing that I do for fun. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy having the conversations, researching, digging on stuff, going, experiencing things. You cannot, I don't think in today's society, I don't think you can build quite the following like Fred has and not be above board. I think you have to be, because someone is going to rat you out on a long enough timeline. If you're that person, it will come out, because, you know, hell, we all got to see Pam and Tommy Lee have sex, right?
Right.
That was something that was done in privacy, and that was 20 some odd years ago. If you're taking money, it's eventually going to sneak out, and you're going to be ruined at that point.
It would be legitimately the equivalent of, and Fred obviously has a much larger following than I will ever have. It would literally be the equivalent of me trying to scrub my social media presence and running for political office. You know?
Right. Well, I mean, I think you don't have to scrub anything. I think that if you've seen anything about the political climate, anything's a possibility right now, right? Like everything is fair game. But you're not wrong. And that's what I'm getting. Like, that really just sounds like a lot of sour grapes. Just people being like, I wished I was at that level where someone would send me whiskey for free so I could tell you whether it's good or not, or
Right.
someone would pay me for my opinion. I don't want anybody to pay me for my opinion ever, because
And I've had it happen with distillers before too. Now there's two different ways this happens. And the one way I don't mind, like a friend that's a distiller is like, hey man, we've tried sending our whiskey to Fred and like we're not getting a response.
Mhm.
How did you get the attention that you did? And I'm like, listen, guys, there's no secret to it. And I told the ones that I'm friends with and they're pure hearted about this. They don't mean they're not asking me to do them a favor. They're not asking me to push it or anything. I'm like, give him time. Because that's the thing about him. Like all the shit that he's said about us, he give me no fucking warning. The
Right.
only warning he might give me is be like 10 minutes before the show, like,
Hey,
might want
something's
to
about to
tune in.
happen.
Yeah. You might want to tune in tonight, and then it's not followed by anything positive or negative, which keeps
Right.
me on the fucking edge, like trying to not have a fucking heart attack while I'm watching this shit. Right. But then the
Mhm.
other side is then you get the guys that are like, again, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. How do you get your stuff to Fred?
Right.
Don't make shit. There you go. Not that Fred's palate's not for everybody, obviously.
Mhm.
Right. But if you're going to be that way, and that's what you're implying is, hey, there's got to be a little secret to this,
Yeah.
or the number of distillers, this falls in the same sort of category. The number of distillers that will call and then they'll say something that they're thinking about doing or they've done to their product that's kind of shady, and then it's implied like, oh, everybody does this.
Mhm.
No, not everybody fucking does.
That's a pretty broad assumption to be made at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume there's probably like a third category of people that are legitimately your friends that are going to be like, oh, so how much did you pay him just to fuck with you? Like that's got to be a group of people.
Fuck yeah, it's constant, and those are the ones that I want to be friends with.
Right.
Those are the ones I enjoy, right? Because it keeps me in
They
check.
immediately see it and they're immediately the Alan Bishop hotline be like, hey, how much did you pay him?
Oh, dude,
whose ass did you have to kiss?
There's three. I have three text message groups on Facebook, and it's just full of assholes. It's just full of the biggest assholes in the industry, and I fucking love them.
That's the best people, because you're going to get a genuine response. They're going to give you that, but then they're also going to know they appreciate it. I have a similar group of folks, just in my personal life, that it's the same way.
Yeah, I made the mistake one time on Distillers Talk of calling a lighthouse a light tower. And I've never lived that fucking down to this fucking day. There's one of those three groups. So one is called the Assholes. One is called Shocker Deluxe. And then the other one is called Light Tower Tour Group. So you kind of see where this is going. But so this brings up something interesting. And this might be a good place to close out potentially here. And anytime you'd like me to come on, I'll be glad to come on as well. And we'll send you some products next time too. We'll give you some little samples of some cool stuff that's not out yet, and maybe we can do a little tasting or something. But you mentioned Bo Cumberland's channel on YouTube earlier, and you guys have probably seen that there's a trailer out for something called the Alan Bishop Experience. I think it's implied the Alan fucking Bishop Experience. And
absolutely, yes, no, that is the entire reason I am subscribed to that channel now. I just saw it come through, and I'm like, nice. I appreciate. And then I watched everything else he had, and I'm like, there we go. Let's go.
He's got great stuff. Bo's a fantastic filmmaker. And the Maddie Gladden videos are on there. The Lee Sinclair videos are on there too. But this documentary originally started out as Bo, just like all the documentaries he does, wanting to kind of document my distilling efforts and all that stuff. And me being the way that I am, I'm like, Bo's very kind of, he's very structured of like, how would you like to present this? What would you like to happen? Blah, blah. And my response to that was, fuck that, Bo. Make the movie that you want to make, right? And I literally made it as difficult on Bo as what I possibly fucking could. Like I could not have made this experience any more difficult than what it is for Bo, because all I really wanted him to capture was sort of the more overall belief system and point of view that I have, and the idea of being a little bit of a jester in the whiskey industry. But more importantly than that was filming. He filmed once at the distillery, and then he filmed twice at our farm. And both times he filmed at the farm, we invited all those groups of assholes. And some of them couldn't make it, unfortunately, because they lived too far away. But what I wanted was this representation of, this is what whiskey or distilling community really looks like. And this is what it's about. Like people that, like, if I'm off on fucking Saturday, I'll spend the day to set up a still site to make it look like it would have looked like when we were making moonshine. We'll get a bunch of drinks together. Me and my wife put a bunch of fucking food together. Let's go out to the woods, have a bonfire, get drunk, right? And whatever shenanigans happen. And
Right.
so Bo captured like 42 hours of the biggest shit show on planet Earth and somehow edited this thing into a cohesive the last print I saw was an hour and a half, a cohesive hour and a half documentary that fucking works. And I don't know how he did it, but it's fucking amazing. Now, there's still a lot of shit show stuff in there, but I think people will enjoy it greatly.
So my question becomes, and maybe we'll finish with that, is how much do I need to send Bo to get the stuff that hit the cutting room floor? Because that's the story that he's got, the story that the storyteller's telling, and I'm gonna appreciate all of that. I guarantee you I will watch it, because and my wife will too, because that's straight up our alley. But
right.
I need the other stuff too. I want to see the stuff that he was like, no, that is too, I can't put that on YouTube. That's the stuff. Like, is
He's
there a
got a lot of,
what do we got to do here?
A lot of B-roll stuff, and there will be a lot of it at the end of the movie. There's nothing that I will say this. There's nothing that I say or do at any point in time that is not something that I would not say or do on social media, which does not, again, win me a whole lot of fans.
I don't think that's a real high bar to jump over, because you feel like you're pretty straightforward that you're going to say what you're going to say, regardless of whether social media is there or not.
Exactly. There were some pretty major fucking shenanigans that happened. Absolutely. And I'm sure most of that stuff at some point in time will come out, for sure. I was trying to think. So there's obviously things that weren't in that trailer, that'll be in the movie. Like somebody brought a bunch of tannerites, and we had.
I mean, it's not a gathering in the woods without tannerite.
No, fuck no, not in Southern Indiana for sure. And I might have had an empty whiskey barrel that we've stuffed full of fucking tannerite and MAP gas containers, and we blew up a whiskey barrel. And I don't know if you got this on film or not, but Amzie Winning, who I absolutely love, he's fucking hilarious because Amzie's full of all this information, all these facts you don't think about. And I'll never forget this. We were by the end of the night, and we should have never been, trying to blow up this barrel, but why wouldn't you, right? We're on top of a hill out in the middle of nowhere, and out of nowhere, Amzie, who can somehow be more drunk than anyone you've ever met, and yet keep his shit together in a way that you can't logically explain, just out of nowhere goes, oh yeah, the Starlink satellites are supposed to be coming overnight. And I hear him saying, I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? And like Santa Claus splitting the sky.
There it is.
2 seconds later, there they fucking go. Just shit like that. That you can't make that stuff up. I got him drunk enough during the first filming. I think everybody except for Bo and Jolie went mud fossil hunting at one point in time, and it became a competition of who has the best mud fossil they can show off.
Okay, so is mud fossil hunting a real thing, or is that like snipe hunting?
It's a little bit of both. So, yeah.
My immediate impression was like, there's a little bit of ass hattery here, and maybe some truth.
Yep. It's there's an art and a science to mud fossiling, but I just came up with it because one time I think Amzie even says it, he talks about it in the documentary. But Amzie used to be a geologist, and I told him I found a piece of petrified wood, which I legit thought was a piece of petrified wood. I don't fucking know. I'm not a geologist. It looked like a piece of petrified wood.
Right.
And Amzie literally gives me like the 30-minute dissertation about why there was no petrified wood in the state of Indiana. And I'm like, fuck you, Amzie. Right. So then I read this fundamentalist Christian thing about, you look up, there's a thing called Mud Fossil University on YouTube. And they look at these rocks that look like they could have been this thing. And the idea is that the flood happened so quickly that these creatures were covered with mud and it preserved their pure form. Right. And so you're just looking for things that look like shit, right? Like I found a rock that looked like a snapping turtle's head, and then, that was a napping turtle mud fossil. It takes a year to make a mud fossil.
I absolutely love this. I'm going to end up having to introduce mud fossil hunting to my children at this point.
It's great, man. I have so much fun with it, and I literally I do a lot of rock hounding for fun, anyways. One of the things I do to blow off steam. And once I started doing the mud fossil thing, then it went from like looking for geodes and arrowheads and fossils to like, hey man, that looks an awful lot like a fucking goose head over there. I'm gonna pick it up and I'm gonna do a mud fossil video and challenge AMSI. Or like the Dusty Rhodes videos. I don't know if you've seen those or not, but I stole a secondhand jacket from Joe Lee. That's an American flag jacket, right? It's the most Kid Rock thing that I've ever seen in my life.
Right.
And I stole it. No, but it should. And so I stole that from her. And DJ Henderson, my best friend, who's also working on a film with me about the history of distilling here in Southern Indiana, he left a pair of like douchebaggy sunglasses over here one time. So got drunk one night and I was like, I'm going to cut a Dusty Rhodes promo from pro wrestling. Right. And it turned into a thing. And the reason it started was because Jolie found this jacket and she was going to keep it because she thought it was cool. And then I was drunk and I stole it from her. And now I refuse to give it back to her. So every once in a while, I have to cut a Dusty Rhodes promo just to fuck with her.
Right. Like you still have the thing that she wants back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now it's become, it's being shipped around the country currently to a few other collaborators who are also friends with Jolie, along with the sunglasses. And those guys are going to cut Dusty Rhodes promos.
So this is an epic trolling. Like this is a nationwide trolling that you have orchestrated here.
This has become the Brotherhood of the Traveling Douche Jacket.
There's a book in there. There's a book. Yes. You can write a book. You're gonna be on the New York Times bestseller list from this.
But see, those little things. The only reason I bring the mud fossil thing up and that whole thing up in the documentary, those are the kind of things that actually make this industry fun. When you find those people who can be as irreverent as what you are, and still talk good shop and still understand whiskey, those are the ones I want to be friends with, right? And everybody else I appreciate greatly. I just, there's that line there, and whatever. It's kind of a tangent, but.
Yeah. You're not wrong. I mean, like whiskey can be serious, but it doesn't have to be as serious as most people want it to be.
Nope. We're not curing cancer here. We're making whiskey. That's what we're doing.
I mean, you may eventually, but
maybe. Not today.
Right. So I truly appreciate your time. We're at 2 hours. You've got to go watch Moonshiners and get your blood pressure up.
Yell to TV.
Absolutely want to have you back. Sooner rather than later. I enjoyed this. And the reality is I started this podcast with the idea of I want to get some not notoriety, some experience under my belt, and then start inviting people to have conversations because that's what I really wanted to do. So I enjoyed it. Thank you for your time. Yeah. Thank you for agreeing to come on.
If you ever need an introduction, if there's anybody that you don't have a contact with that you want to talk to, let me know. And we'll touch base with them and put you in touch with them. And, a lot of people would like doing this kind of thing, especially distillers. They like having more laid back conversations like this. They're fun. They're free flowing, and you get a lot of good info.
I listen to a lot of the people I want to talk to, and I try to not ask the questions that other people have already asked. Like There's nothing. I work in an industry where I give the same status report 5 times a week. And man, after the 5th time, I want to run off and jump off the balcony of my house here. So I'm like, if I can avoid the shit everybody else is asking, let's talk about something new and interesting. In that vein, I appreciate you being on here. I appreciate your interview that you did about landrace gardening. We didn't talk about that at all, but I have that book now. I gave it to my wife. Our COVID pandemic project was I built a greenhouse because that's a thing she's into. And so this landrace gardening is now a thing. Maybe that's a conversation for next time, but
definitely.
I appreciate you joining me. I'm going to hit my outro. So I'm going to remove you from this. Thank you for being here tonight, Alan.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Embellish Podcast. Whenever you happen to watch this, whether it's tonight or today, I hope you give it a review, do something like that. Hope you found it entertaining. If you did, please leave me a review. Like I said, please leave a review, a comment, whatever. Hit me up on social media, Twitter, Instagram, EmbellishPod or embellishpod.com, TikTok, wherever you happen to find me, Facebook. That's where I'm hopefully everywhere at this point. And if you give me a follow, you can kind of see what's going on. All of my links are on embellishpod.com, accounts, contact details. I'll be back again next week with another new offering for you. I hope you enjoyed what we talked about tonight. Got a few more planned in the very near future, but that's where we'll leave it for tonight. So thank you.